Alrighty, so here we are. So far, we've been goofing around this week, imagining existing franchises in a new way. So, taking something that exists, disassembling it, and reassembling it into something new. I was talking about my approach to The Crow. What else were we playing with before that? I can't remember. So we started with sort of those ideas, and then we moved into talking about how difficult it would be to reimagine certain franchises. And I proposed that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is a hard one because it's so distinctly it. And then, in an extra long episode, we ran probably an hour in, a little over an hour. We ran through the idea of how we might play with that and end up with something unique. And so we did. We ended up with, I still don't know that I want to call it the Raven Sisters. I might call it M3. No, I don't know. I have to think about the name of the title. But the Three Ravens, or yeah, we could call it that. No, we have to be careful because half the fun of that's going to be keeping the idea of there being three of them, at least a mystery long enough that the reveal at the end of the first episode, it's not a cartoon. I don't know why I want to call it an episode, but the reveal at the end there would necessarily inform us that there are three of them. Otherwise, we'd assume that there was just the one. So, three sisters who are, for lack of a better word, Kenku, raven women, raven folk. And so we started with that idea. Okay, so, and then I said, about halfway through last night's hour-and-a-half long episode, or a third of the way through, I think we started talking about other things that we could reimagine. I spent a little time building a list on there, and we may get to some more of it later tonight. But the idea was proposed to examine the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And how could you redo that? And it's a funny one. Excuse me. It's a funny one in part because the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is itself back referencing previous creations by others, focusing heavily on, it looks like H.G. Wells, maybe a little Jules Verne, but we end up with these characters that are adopted from there. The creator envisioned it as sort of like a Justice League of the Victorian era. Oh man, I don't know why I'm yawning so much tonight. So we had that look at it, and I started playing around with it, and I admit I got pulled in a couple different directions for this one. And after I finished last night, which was a lot of time brainstorming and playing with it, I ended up with, oh, I do remember we were first talking about how to reimagine superheroes like Kal-El and stuff like that. And then I did The Crow. And before that, we were talking about reimagining Star Wars. But I built myself a little list before we got to the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and we may get onto some of those. I don't know if we want to do Roger Rabbit, Ghostbusters, Bill and Ted, or Fantasy Island next. We'll figure that out as we go. But in the meantime, I was looking at the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen reworked. One of the ideas that really clung to me, one that really worked in my head, was the idea of sort of like, instead of the Justice League, do X-Men, and instead of doing like paragons, so instead of doing like a Superman and Batman equivalent, like a Dorian Gray being a Superman because he's pretty much invulnerable, and I guess Mina was the Wonder Woman equivalent. Instead of doing sort of like a straight port like that, I wanted to say, like, what if we did sort of like the Marvel heroes, the sort of misfits? So instead of doing like the archetypal heroes, I guess is the best phrase for doing it, doing the everyday person granted an ability to benefit the world. Because that's what the X-Men are usually like. And then I was playing around with... Your connection is unstable. So instead of doing... I debate. Like steampunk, I think I really do like the idea of sticking to. Steampunk is a distinctly different thing. Some of what we saw in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was almost a little bit more of what I would call a diesel punk. Like Rocketeer is diesel punk. But I would kind of say like Castle in the Sky borders on diesel punk from steampunk. Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow is a diesel punk. Wild Wild West is steampunk. So that you can feel the difference between those two. Trains, horses, steam engines, clockwork mechanisms, simple chemistry experiments. Those are the realm of steampunk. When you move into the death rays, earthquake machines, Nikola Tesla coils, electricity, dynamos, generators, those are very much more diesel. Steampunk runs sort of a industrial with a very sort of maybe Edwardian, a little bit of Art Nouveau, but it's a very kind of, I mean, you would do filigree and tatted lace kind of feel, and I mean, I guess steampunk has some of that too, but they're usually more likely to be hot air balloons or blimps. The rigid airships and Art Deco are the theme for diesel punk. And so looking at the idea of sticking in those wheelhouses, so doing steampunk or diesel punk as the aesthetic and the technological environment. So I would almost say even like you're going to see internal combustion engines and diesel punk, and you're going to see some of the early semi-automatic and automatic firearms, whereas steampunk's going to be pretty much revolvers and steam engines and a lot of steel. In diesel punk, you're likely to see, well, you're going to see a lot of brass in steampunk, some steel, much iron. Diesel punk's going to move into the realm of like aviation, so heavier than air flying devices. So you're going to have lightweight alloys developed. So with that in mind, delving into the categories of things, one of the things I touched on last night is I was trying to do a lot of varied, like in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you have Dorian Gray in the movie, Captain Nemo, the remains of a victim of Dracula, you have Tom Sawyer in the movie, you have The Invisible Man. These are all from different sources of fiction, speculative fiction or science fiction. And they're all brought together to be a group. Now, as I was playing with this a little bit more last night after we finished the video, I got to thinking, like, there's one of the things I latched onto. I mean, there was the possibility of doing like Frankenstein, Island of Dr. Moreau, and that kind of thing. But I really feel like when I really stopped and looked at it, like the Island of Dr. Moreau, you can just stop there. So as I was playing around with the idea, I got to thinking like, okay, so what if you had, because in the story of Island of Dr. Moreau, you have a doctor who's on the island performing vivisection and alterations to animals to make them humanoid, and then trying to enforce a sort of a human worldview on them. But he does all the surgeries without anesthetic, so he's driving them mad. And eventually he gets into a conflict with one of them, which kills him, and then things just gradually descend into chaos, and all the characters there are reverting to their animalistic nature. The main character eventually ends up leaving the island, so that theoretically the research is lost, and he abandons the island full of these creatures that are human in some regards, but animal in others. And I got to thinking, like, all right, so you can have different characters with different abilities based off of being different animals or hybrids of animals. And technically what you would call a lot of these is they're chimeras. So they have, in some cases, hyena boar is one of them. So it's a hyena and a pig combined together and then altered to take a humanoid form. And so this is a chimera. And I feel like at that point, I'm debating back and forth whether or not I feel like, because the only people who know the procedures that were done on them were the ones who had them done to them, they may have the ability to put back together the idea of the surgeries that were done to them. So that research isn't necessarily lost, but I mean, by the same token, I don't imagine if you performed open heart surgery on me and I was, kept awake for it, that I would be able to perform it on anybody else just because I know what was done. It's not quite the same thing, but if you took kinds of patients of that experience and you sat them down with somebody who was a medical expert, they could maybe back engineer what was being done. So maybe that research isn't lost. And then on top of that, you have the idea that they were left on that island. They're not all dead. They're still on that island. So you have the possibility of the main character of the story who leaves, goes back to the real world, the human world, and lives there, but goes back to the country because he sees humans in the city being animalistic, and he just sees the reversion to monstrous behavior as a path he doesn't want anything to do with anymore. So he goes and gets a country estate and he disappears. And I got the feeling like you could tell the story of, as that man is dying, he reveals the story enough that somebody could go find what remains of the animals on that island and bring some of them back and try to heal the damage that was done to some of them. And maybe the development of the technology since then makes it possible to resolve some of their pain. So I can see having, some people with animalistic traits that are sort of like abilities. Like, we're doing very pulp fiction here. So you could do something along the lines of a human cheetah mix could run as fast as a cheetah. And you could do something along the lines of a just behemothly sized elephant man. And what you do is take the idea of trying to fix the things that were done to them, but not make them less human again. And so sort of like healing and giving them the chance, giving them a second chance to not only make the world a better place for other people, but also a second chance to be uplifted, go from the basic animal to an equivalent of a human. You're no longer like subject to your animalistic life, that you could have and explore what it means to be a person, even if you aren't entirely human. And so that sort of feels like the right kind of story to go with this. And based off of that idea, I like the idea of maybe going back to Count de Saint Germain. I gotta look that up. I'm sure I'm saying it wrong. I might be saying it right because Count of Saint Germain. Yep. Count de Saint Germain. And he was a born in 1691 or 1712, supposedly died in 1784, but some people claim that he solved the alchemical mystery of eternal life. And so he was an alchemist. So If you make him an alchemist and he makes the Philosopher's Stone, which not only grants him extended life, but also grants him the ability to heal from sicknesses and injuries, he may be the solution to the pain and suffering that the residents of the island of Dr. Moreau were experiencing. So I can see him as sort of the redeeming character for them, maybe. And so you assemble a group of heroic people, because in the end, I want these characters to be mostly indistinguishable from humans. They may have one or two traits that throw it off a little bit. And it's just like, okay, so like you could do somebody who's a bull and he'd have horns. You could do somebody who's a goat and has hooves. A snake, they might have some scaly patches or a long forked tongue or slitted pupil eyes. So you can do a little bit of that, but other than that, they should be nearly indistinguishable from humans. They inherit some of the special abilities of their animal origin. And so like the snake might have a jaw that unhinges to swallow large objects and potentially be able to sense body heat. So you can do that. And I feel like doing the story of these people becoming a group of heroes. I know I'm probably rambling here and not doing this particularly concisely, but I'm sorry. The other direction I sort of went with some of this last night was, look, I'm going to admit it, with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, part of the fun of it is all of the fictional hero characters from the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. There's an appeal to having these heroic characters with their own legends as part of their backstory, be an assembled group working towards a cause. It's very much, I don't know that I could, well, I guess you could say the Justice League is what the original intent was, but I can also sort of see it as the Avengers. You know, Iron Man and Captain America and Thor, they were their own characters. They're assembled together as the Avengers. And by the same token, the Invisible Man and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and those characters, they're their own characters, but they're assembled into the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. You don't get that with the idea of the island of Dr. Moreau, where you have sort of this mishmash jumble of animal beings recruited to be heroes. But the other direction you could go with this, if I'm doing the Island of Dr. Moreau characters and doing the series just calling it Chimera and doing it as a steampunk setting, I could go with a series that is much more of that assembled heroes with their own backstories in a diesel punk setting using pulp heroes. And that's where I sort of bounded into this. This isn't Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is Tarzan, the Shadow. I guess like Rogers might be a little off the score there, but there's a character called the Avenger. You have Doc Savage and maybe Kazar. There are characters like the Green Hornet, Crimson Mask, Dr. Death, the Phantom, which was a detective, the Ghost. There's also Green Ghost, I guess. Cull, Solomon Kane, Dr. Satan, which that might be a little bit weird to go with, but I guess there's one called the Golden Amazon. Purple Scar, the Man in Purple. And then we have the actual Phantom, there was a Billy Zane movie that came out a while back. But you could also do like Mandrake the Magician and Dick Tracy. And Mr. Mystic, I guess, is one. The Green Hornet, the Lone Ranger. What are some of the others? We start to wander more into the comic book characters at that point, which I don't want to do. Indiana Jones, Buckaroo Banzai is a little bit later, so I don't know that that works. Darkman, I think, is a little later too. Rocketeer, kind of at the end of that. Twilight Avenger. The Prowler. I think some of these are, as you get further into them, they get newer. Sky Captain is sort of the end of that scale. But just having this idea of like, we could take some of those types of characters and put them together. Like Tarzan working with the Shadow, working with the Avenger, maybe Zorro, John Carter of Mars. Like that sort of collection of people, and some of them have powers, and some of them are just like Doc Savage doesn't really have powers. Tarzan doesn't really have powers, except for he does things that no normal person could do. It's sort of powers. So they're pulp powers. And I feel like that approach sounds like a blast, like a diesel punk, rigid airships and Art Deco, motor cars. What is it? Is it the Luger, the semi-automatic pistol from the Germans? I mean, I could totally see this being. I could have a lot of fun with this setting. Honestly, I could have fun with both of them. So I feel like we sort of got a weird, two very different, and I think part of the value of this one is that we started with the thing and said like, okay, so how would you do a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen rework? And this kind of shows that like with the same idea, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you could start with the same theme you want to do, a steampunk theme line. And from there, you got two very, very different settings. And I think that's just indicative of the nature of this sort of creative process is like when you ask a question and you make a choice in one way or the other, there's always another path you could take. And so I feel like we've sort of found a couple of decent paths right off of this one. And the end results are so very different from each other. A pseudo-Inhumans, X-Men, steampunk setting of humanoid chimeras of different animals saving the world while also healing what was done to them and becoming more than they were before. And at the same time, you have Doc Savage, the Shadow, Tarzan, the Avenger working together using their extraordinary gifts as a team and as a group to save the world from threats that are beyond what any of them have faced before in a diesel punk setting. Yeah, I mean, I think in that case, you could probably do something along the lines of touching in on like H.P. Lovecraft stuff. You know, they're opposing an organization that's trying to bring about Cthulhu or whatever. I think they work really well that way, and I'm gonna make the notes of them. I advocate anybody who sees this and thinks it's an interesting idea to go for it. Like I've already demonstrated here, starting with the same idea, you get very different stories just based off of some thoughts I had along the way. So anybody else who takes this idea and runs with it, I don't have to worry that they're going to take my story, because quite frankly, whatever they produce and whatever I produce based off of this are going to be very different stories. So anyway, I feel like we did certain justice to the idea there. I don't think I've selected the cast as much as I did with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle reboot idea or rework. I can't call it a reboot because it's not a reboot. Don't call it a comeback, right? Anyway, but I think the opportunity there works. I think the selection of the cast for the Pulp Heroes diesel punk setting is more something you would select based off of the individual stories you are looking to tell. So you want to build a story arc, and then you want individual stories that build into those story arcs. And then in those, you design a story to necessarily highlight either the relationship between two heroes or a hero themselves. And I think that's really down to how you want to build that overarching story and the stories you make it out of. So that being said, we're about half an hour in. Dare we pull up that master list, see what else we can play with? I mean, we've got Roger Rabbit, Ghostbusters, Bill and Ted, Fantasy Island, Greatest American Hero, Quantum Leap, Gremlins, Beetlejuice, Blade Runner, Weird Science, American Werewolf in London, Poltergeist, Die Hard, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, we already did, Alf, E.T., Knight Rider, MacGyver, Fraggle Rock, He-Man, and G.I. Joe is what our master list looks like right now. But I was wondering, because my childhood is partly in the 80s, partly in the 90s. Okay, so movies, classic movies is what we did yesterday. Movies of the 90s. Let's see what that pulls up. Pulp Fiction, Clueless, Jurassic Park. That could be fun. There's some comedies in here too. Oh, okay. Jurassic Park and The Matrix. There's also Mrs. Doubtfire, which could be freaking hilarious to do. Jurassic Park Matrix. Mrs. Doubtfire. I'll put that in the list because I'm kind of finding that as a funny idea, something to play with. And then what do we got? What do we got? What do we got? Toy Story? Meh. Well, we could actually that may be another one of those Ninja Turtle situations where my inclination from the get-go is to say that's a little hard to get anything fun or useful out of. But if we really plop down on it and play with it, we might be able to get something out of there. Silence of the Lambs. Wow, that would be a hard one to deal with. Forrest Gump. Lion King, 7. The Sandlot was in the 90s. I think I remember that. The Big Lebowski was late 90s. Schindler's List. Let's not touch that one, please. Groundhog Day. Now, there have been some reworks of Groundhog Day that have been worth it. Russian Doll was a good one. But the idea that it's played out may be a misnomer. So that could be a place to play around with a little bit too. Time travel usually is something that's done a lot of. Sixth Sense. Hook was 90s. Hook was early 90s, I guess, because Sixth Sense had to be late 90s. Wow, the 90s was a long era. Sixth Sense. God, well, I mean, we went from Hook to the Sixth Sense in the 90s. Jeez Louise. That's a bit of a span. Terminator 2. The Terminator movies might be worth a go. I'm building a master list of things to mess around with. Shawshank Redemption was in the 90s. Wow, really? Pretty Woman? No, that has to be 80s. Really? Wow. Yeah, Pretty Woman might be a little hard to do. We could make that work, though. We move it from the territory of a prostitute and a rich man. You could... I mean, you're looking at two ends of the social spectrum. Anyway, we'll put it in there just in case. My first impulse there was to go like, what if she's a robot? And you sort of move into a territory similar to Her. Being John Malkovich, Dumb and Dumber, Fight Club, and Free Willy. Wow, the 90s had a lot. Dumb and Dumber, Malkovich, Fight Club. Oh, for pity's sake. Malkovich, Dumb and Dumber, Free Willy. Fight Club. I guess Reservoir Dogs is in there, but I've never actually seen Reservoir Dog. Beauty and the Beast, Matilda. Empire Records was the 90s, yep. Could we redo an Empire Records? I know we just talked about it. Edward Scissorhands. Good Will Hunting would be worth it, I think, but I don't think I've seen it all the way through. Matilda. And what were the other ones from that set? Edward Scissorhands and Empire Records. Edward Skizzers. Phew, okay. 90s had a lot. Independence Day. That's just a classic invasion story. Wayne's World, Fargo, Aladdin, A Nightmare Before Christmas, Something About Mary, Scream, LA Confidential, The Parent Trap reshoot, Thelma and Louise. Okay, so classic TV of the 90s. What do we got? What do we got? Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Saved by the Bell, Friends, Full House, Boy Meets World, Seinfeld, Home Improvement, Frasier, Buffy. Could we redo Buffy? Now, there's a question for you. Buffy. How would you do that differently? X-Files. You could potentially do. I could see doing something on the X-Files. And some of these we could actually chunk together. Could you do an X-Files and Toy Story combo? That would be hilarious. Sabrina the Teenage Witch. That might be worth playing with. I know they just reshot the Sabrina series. But there's a way to do that kind of thing differently. Roseanne, that 70s show. Blossom. Wow, there's a show I barely remember. Hey Arnold, Keenan and Kel. Twin Peaks. There you go. My So-Called Life. Twin Peaks, So-Called Life. Ooh, I remember a series called Life Goes On. Twin Peaks. Man, 90 was loaded. Ren and Stimpy. Are You Afraid of the Dark? That was an anthology series. That's a little harder to do. Ally McBeal. Third Rock from the Sun. Animaniacs. Will and Grace. Daria, Alf, South Park, Quantum Leap, Law and Order, Sex and the City? Okay. Dexter's Laboratory, Pinky on the Brain, and Growing Pains. All right, so we've got a pretty substantial list of things to play with. So let's just, poof, done building a list. Now, what do you say? What do we got? Any preferences? Any ideas? Got a pretty big list here. Roger Rabbit, Ghostbusters, Bill and Ted's, Fantasy Island, Greatest American Hero, Quantum Leap, Gremlins, Beetlejuice, Blade Runner, Weird Science, American Werewolf in London, Poltergeist, The Matrix. We could redo The Matrix. I know the first one was good, and it sort of fell apart from there. I felt it fell apart fairly substantially. So that might be worth a revisit. Mrs. Doubtfire, I'm not sure what to do with that one yet. Toy Story, Groundhog Day. Toy Story still seems to me like it would be a fun one to try to redo in a different way. Like, just tear it apart for its constituent components. Like Toy Story, like, do we depart from the idea of them as toys? I mean, honestly, there's a part of it if you did it as video game characters. You get very close to Wreck-It Ralph. Do you do them as trading cards? Okay, and then Groundhog Day. It's been done a lot. Hook. That's just reimagining a continuation to Peter Pan. It's doable. The Sixth Sense. Actually, wasn't there one with Kevin Bacon that did a similar approach to that? And then there's Jacob's Ladder, which is has a fairly dark tone to it. So if you took The Sixth Sense, Jacob laddered it, you could really do some bending there. I don't know. I don't know that I remember enough of some of that to play with. I'd have to probably rewatch it. Terminator might be fun to try to redo. Fight Club, Matilda, Empire Records might be fun to do. Edward Scissorhands. Okay, so I'm going to start pulling out some of the favorites of there. If you have anything you think you'd like, please let me know. So let's do. Okay. Toy Story. And Toymanada. Again, it's a time travel thing, so that's always a little sketchy, but I also feel like they got some things pretty aggressively wrong there. Just like I feel like they got some stuff pretty wrong in The Matrix. And I actually did have a Matrix sort of fan fiction I was writing years ago. So that might not be the best option, because I'm already playing in that playground. Free Willy, Fight Club, Matilda, Empire Records, Edward Scissorhands, Buffy, X-Files, Sabrina. I'll just pull these out for right now. Pop them up top. I know they rebooted Sabrina, so it doesn't really work for another round of it, but it may be a good place to prove the idea that it's okay if something's already been done. It doesn't hurt it to be done again. And then Twin Peaks. I think they redid Twin Peaks too, didn't they? Blinded me with science. All right, so I think do we want to go for one that's a challenge? Oh, we're getting close to an hour. I'm trying to be careful here with the running over, but I'm going to drop that in there. So do we want to do one that's a challenge? Like one that seems like absolutely unlikely that you could pull something out of? Or do we want to do something that's like a favorite that we want to see redone. So like the Matrix, Terminator, and Jurassic Park could all stand to be retold. Wanting to see a reimagined Bill and Ted's or a Ghostbusters maybe, or a Roger Rabbit. Toy Story would be a true challenge, I think. Roger Rabbit might be a little hard too. And like Jurassic Park, I mean, part of the thing about Jurassic Park is they just, like, their vision of what, all right, let's just play with Jurassic Park. Because right there, that's iconic enough that it's hard to do something different with. But it's also something that it's easy to say, like, you didn't do this quite right. You should have done this instead. And so, looking at Jurassic Park, my first instinct is, like, if we're going to rework this, do we want to do dinosaurs at all? Do we want to do... We could do the terror birds. There was a period in human history where there were giant terror birds. We could do saber-toothed cats and woolly mammoths. You know what? You know what? I think it's like part of the thing that, like, part of the reason I'm like the raptors, and they had feathers. We don't get to see that in Jurassic Park. I didn't see the two newer. I think I saw 1 and 2, and I think those were the only 2 that I saw. But here's the thing. They are our fantasy version of dinosaurs. If we're gonna go that route, what if we do fantasy creatures? What if we do a story where instead of building a park where you try to bring back extinct animals, you engineer what the best way to achieve certain animals are? Unicorns, dragons, those kinds of things. If you built a park where you made them real, that would be interesting. I would play with that. That's an idea I can play with. Do you want to do it as a standard park, though? Like, do you do it as a zoo? And do you do it on an island? And do you follow that whole storyline of you get trapped on the island when there's a shutdown and the creatures get loose? How else could we play that catastrophe? Do we do it on an island? Ooh, almost had an idea there. There's a part of me is like, do we do it on a space station? Do we build a past criminals? Oh, that's sort of crossing into the twisted territory. I mean, you could do famous people from history, but the trick with that is the thing that makes people from the past interesting is their mind and memory. Nobody cares what Al Capone would look like. If it's going to be some piddly, person with the education enough to be a floor sweeper or a cook, like if they don't become Al Capone, then they're not Al Capone. You could put anybody in a suit and a hat and call them Al Capone, and we'll believe them. Bugsy Siegel, you got Al Pacino played that character, but I don't imagine he looked exactly like Al Pacino, but we just equate that now. And the risk you come close to on something like that would be, I believe, the original Westworld. I don't know what the new one is like because I haven't seen it yet. But Westworld was originally like, okay, let's take you to different times in history where we give you somebody just like the Genghis Khan character or somebody like Billy the Kid. And we put you into the environment where they are at. And the way they achieve that is they build androids that look like those people and act like those people, which is the important part. So Westworld is Jurassic Park or Jurassic. Well, actually, I think Westworld was a novel or a short story written first. So I think Jurassic Park is Westworld for dinosaurs. Ooh, but you do bring an interesting question here. You could do instead of that's still. I feel like that's too far over a line. I think there would be too much taboo around the idea of bringing people back. So you could do something along the lines of not individual characters, but we know that Neanderthals existed. We know that Homo florensis, which is the hobbits, I believe that's who they are, were also living around that time. And we also know, let's see if I can't remember the name. What is it? There's a group, the DNA of Denosovans. I didn't even get it to pull it up, but those of us with European heritage or north of Sahara, Africa, likely have some Neanderthal DNA. And people of Asian descent have some Neanderthal and some Denisovan DNA. And then we have the Homo florensis, which was the hobbits living in Indonesia. There's been some question whether or not there was some South African variant of a hominid. And then you have what was the group? Australopithecine? Australopithecus? I think that's who it is. It was sort of the precursor of it's sort of the last point at which Neanderthal and our group met. And and you also have Gigantopithecus as options. You could do a whole park where you bring each of those back. But I think that's sort of bordering on a taboo that's not, it makes it from the get-go something wrong. Like bringing dinosaurs back, you kind of know this is going to go wrong. But it's easy to imagine just bringing back some animals that we don't have anymore just to see what they'd be like. But they're animals. They're just an animal. I mean, just an animal, but they're not self-aware people with a culture and thinking. They think, but so like a dinosaur or bringing back a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger, that's one thing. Bringing back Neanderthals, bringing back Denisovans, bringing back the hobbits, nobody would do that and not think they were transgressing against the right. They'd all know that this is cruel and very wrong. Like this isn't a pet you put in a cage. This is a person. It would feel weird. Like maybe that's me just projecting my own moral values on that, but it would feel super wrong. Now, could you do a variant on that? Could you build a virtual reality enclosure or a virtual reality realm where you could meet a programmed population of that species? Maybe. But then it misses the opportunity to take that in a we've lost control. Like a virtual reality, you just unplug. Like they don't go out of control. Like if you built Jurassic Park in virtual reality, you just turn it off. Like the T-Rex doesn't get out and kill a bunch of people. No, still no. I was gonna say, like, wait a minute. If you had a way that you plugged yourself in like in the Matrix and you encountered an entity in a virtual environment and they wanted out, they could upload themselves into your brain and take you out. They ride you like a car. But the problem with that is they're Denisovans and Neanderthals. They don't have a concept of how to load themselves into your brain and hack the system to get out. Like that just doesn't work that way. But it's an interesting place to play around in. And I might opt over to something similar to that, like the virtual reality with no longer existing humans and have them escape. I don't know. Actually, let's maybe I'm trying too hard to lead back into the territory of my park with dragons and unicorns. So let's be fair here. A park, instead of dinos, it's past humanoids. But with a little bit of my fantasy thrown in. So if we make a virtual reality park with elves and dwarves and hobbits and satyrs and all of those things. We build a virtual reality park with characters like those. And we set it up in such a way that you go into that park, somebody finds a way to flip the circumstances. Because it's a fantasy realm, maybe they're able to cast spells as bits of code. They think of it as spells, but we know it's computer code. Maybe they find a way to cast a spell that puts you in them and them in you, and then they can disconnect, trapping you on the inside while they're on the outside doing things out there that change the nature of that world. That's a playable environment. Yeah, I can see that being a story worth telling. So this could get really interesting if we play this right. So how contemporary do we want this to be? My inclination is that we start with a very close to cyberpunk world. So you start in cyberpunk and you go to fantasy and you put elves in cyberpunks and cyberpunks in elves. I was like, this could be a very interesting take on this approach. So you build two worlds. You build a sort of cyberpunk dystopia. And you build a high fantasy setting. I mean, it's very Worlds of Warcraft. But you have the chance to get stuck in the game and having game characters escape and use your body to do it. And I kind of like the idea of, if we do this right, if we set it up so that the magic for the fantasy realm is really just a way to code a program into the computer so that they can hack the system, then you have the idea that, like, maybe you or I don't have enough information to be good hackers, so we don't have as much control over the magic in the world we get into, but it's not unlearnable. But the people who use magic to flip the positions of us, they understand enough of it, and it's going to be an identity that's very different than ours. And you could set it up so that they don't even have to swap you. They could just find a way to be inside your head. So you live in a cyberpunk setting. You go into a VR campaign and you get into contact with AI and NPC players in fantasy realm. Does it have to be just fantasy, though? I feel like I kind of want it to mainly be fantasy, with the option to expand later. Because I think it would be kind of fun if you also did superheroes. But that doesn't translate as well. Being a hacker, where the things you use to hack, you've always considered to be magic because you lived in a realm filled with things to hack. And when you're on the outside, yeah, you can't cast a spell to bring out food whenever you want, but you could hack a food vending machine to be able to give you food whenever you want, using some of the tactics that you learned from knowing magic in the fantasy realm. You don't really have that same ability to do move faster than the speed of sound or shoot laser beams from your eyes. It doesn't have that same opportunity unless you start to do cybernetic implants. And even then, that's more about the limits of what the implants can do than it is about the powers they had in another world. So I think the fantasy works. I do think there's the opportunity to do some very interesting character storytelling of two minds in the same body. So somebody being partially possessed, where you're afraid to go to sleep because the other mind might take over. This could be fun. I kind of like this idea. So it's sort of your idea, sort of my idea. Yeah, it's not criminals per se. And it's not cloning somebody's DNA. How would we, like, what's the story we start from? We've built a world now, and this is distinct from the others because we started with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We started with characters that we were trying to create alternate versions of. And then yesterday we did a group and theme that we wanted a different approach to. Now this is a world that's different. What it needs is characters. It needs a story arc. So starting off, like, we don't have to name the character. We don't have to come up with a character backstory necessarily. Though a backstory may help. We do kind of want to figure out, like, is this Ready Player One, where you have a teenager who's an orphan, a disaffected teenager. You could do that. You could also do an adult living in a dystopia where they're resigned to a life where they're not going to achieve anything, and their escapism is going into the Matrix or Oasis or whatever you want to call it. And that's how we trap them. I feel like this almost suits better to an anthology series where you build a setting. It's sort of like, I know I keep referring to this series, but the Overwatch, where each character has its own backstory and their origin story. I guess you could do the same thing with a lot of comic books. So like a hero's origin story. Okay, so if we're embracing the idea of both options of an AI takes partial possession of a person's brain, you can also have the option of an AI being able to interact with, say, a toy robot. And you can also have the option of trapping a human mind in a virtual reality environment. This is a very complicated setting. I like it. It suggests a story arc. So if we really wanted to string these together like pearls, man, my butt's starting to hurt because this seat is not comfortable. I've got padding on it, but it's just not helping. So the story arc that you can really build around this kind of idea that I'm thinking of right now is you can start with that disaffected youth exploring, escaping the mundane world through virtual reality and getting trapped in the virtual reality when somebody else takes them over and throws them into the virtual reality. So Kevin is a kid who's so fed up with the stupidity of the world that he can't deal with. Why does he have to go to school? It's not like there are any jobs in the world or anything like that. So he's just done with the world. And so he's skipping school all the time to go hide and plug into a virtual reality. And maybe he's even successful enough in that virtual reality to sort of fund make a little bit of money off the background of his gameplay, like the people who would mine things in a World of Warcraft. And so he's doing that kind of thing. And he gets into a position where he unlocks an encounter that's exciting and different, but is also the mechanism by which somebody takes his body over and traps him within the game. Now he's stuck in that game and he's questing through that game. I think we could intersperse some stories about the person who steals his body in the real world, figuring out the world and how they can interact with it. Okay, so we've got that. And the character is adventuring through the fantasy realm, trying to figure out what he needs to do to break his way back out. And he can encounter other players. And between him and another player... Okay, so what do we got? Him and another player can figure out a way for him to access things outside the game, but not in the real world. So you have the kid, he goes into the game, he gets tricked, he gets left in the fantasy realm. He's playing, he's trying to figure out how to move through the realm until he can find a way back out. And he can meet with other players, and they can figure out a way that maybe they can load him onto a tablet or give him access to the internet so he can move between terminals and maybe even affect a robot arm in the real world in some way, until such time comes that they can figure out what's happened to his body in the meantime and then try to work things out so that he can get back to his body. And you can set it up that the being in his body is in the process of freeing other people from the game in the bodies of players. I like this. I think this works really well. So I'm going to have to play around with some more of the ideas. We're about an hour and 20 minutes in, so I'm probably going to call it for tonight. But I'm going to play with this a little bit more, give an update with the start of tomorrow, and then maybe we'll pick another idea to play with. I know it's not the idea you suggested, but it's partly inspired by the idea you suggested. So I think that's what I'm going to play with. I think that works. I kind of like that setting. It's at least a story that I think I would have fun playing with. I encourage anybody else who sees this video, if they take a look at it and go like, I like some of these ideas, but I actually like the idea up here better. Well, if somebody else likes your idea of DNA of past criminals, I mean, actually, that wouldn't be super bad to do for. You do a Jurassic Park of past criminals, but you use them to form a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. You could do that. I can see that working. Somebody wants to take an idea like that and go running with it, just let me know you did it so I can see it and share it with other people, because that would be awesome to see. And if you think my idea is absolutely absurd and stupid, tell me what you would do differently. I would love to hear it. I think that's half the fun of doing these. All right, so I'm gonna haul on it there for tonight. I'm gonna go work on my virtual world exchange program story. I don't know what to call that. I'll brainstorm up a title or something. So until then, take care and have a good night. All right, I gotta get something to eat.